as someone who is a believer, I also think you should approach things with a certain amount of skepticism, though, because again, I don't believe that science and the mystical are at all at odds. I don't think they're at cross purposes. I think that the mystical is a part of science that we just don't quite have the language for. And I will be excited if and when we are able to pin some of these things down about where does that energy go. I mean, I think that's I'm full of wonder about that. Welcome to Coffee and Words. It is Halloween. It is the spookiest day of the year. And I have got Eric Sims back on the show with me, this time co-hosting. So welcome back, Eric.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Especially on Halloween episode.
I know. This is like your time. You are the host of the Unseen Paranormal podcast. And I've also brought back international best-selling author and award-winning podcaster Daniel Wilcox. So welcome back to the show as well.
Hello, thank you for inviting me back.
Thank you for being here. And Eric, you have brought two amazing people. So would you like to introduce them to us?
Yes, Liana Renee Hyber and Miss Andrea Janes. They are awesome paranormal authors. I discovered them through a book called Invisible Women in the Paranormal. And I'm sorry, I don't have the name right in front of me.
A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts. Yeah.
And unfortunately, Andrea couldn't join me and Liana. The episode will be out this week that I did with
right
Liana.
Here, Eric.
Yeah, but unfortunately, you couldn't join me on my show. But
on the original one. That was early on, Andrea. That was early on in our.
Oh my God, did I miss that? I was like, oh my God.
No, you were not well that day. This is part 2 of Eric's show. There we go.
Eric, look, we're equally prepared today. I get that vibe. Nice.
But yeah, they're two amazing women who wrote this amazing book, and they do these awesome paranormal tours in New York. And me and Liana just had a great time talking about women in the paranormal and marginalized people in general in the paranormal world. And it was a great conversation. That episode, like I said, will be out this Wednesday. So looking forward to putting that out there and people hearing it.
All right. And this episode will be out this Thursday. So that's kind of cool. We get to have one right after the other.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hear there's some epic mugs on the show today. So maybe we'll just do a quick mug showcase. I'm obsessed with bees right now. So I don't have a really spooky one, but I think it looks cool.
It's so
wow, you really do have 2 mugs.
Cute pumpkin, David. Daniel, that's great. I love that.
It works.
Now I want pumpkin pie. I couldn't decide between my ghosts.
Liana, your pumpkins are so cute. You're the pumpkin ghost.
Asylum for the insane. I need that in my life.
It's so good, isn't it? And then on the back is that's the insane asylum. Blackwell's Island, now Roosevelt Island. So there you go. This was given to me by Marie Carter, one of my tour guides.
Nice. Oh man. All right. We've got ghosts and pumpkins and we're all caffeinated. So let's talk about spooky, dark, creepy things. And let's talk about how throughout human history, it doesn't matter that every society and culture pretty much has had some sort of fascination, elements of fascination with horror and paranormal, with death and spirits. So what is it? Why are humans so drawn to the macabre?
No one.
we all have things to say. We're attempting to be
just waiting patiently for our turn.
Well, too polite to start talking. I got so excited about the question I have to take my sweater off.
For people who are listening to the podcast that want to watch YouTube. Yeah, so I'll jump in, I guess. So my answer is this. I mean, it kind of goes back to human psychology. Like, in order to survive, we as humans had to try to understand that which we do not know. And we've come a long way, arguably, intellectually in the last sort of 100 years or so, but the unknown and understanding the unknown was a way to try and prepare ourselves and protect ourselves. I think that's one of the fascinating things about horror itself is horror is one of the few genres that is also an emotion as opposed to sort of a particular subject. You could obviously argue that romance is, an emotion as well, love, amory, all that kind of thing. But horror particularly, there's something about being spooked that's very, very genetic in our nature. And you know, you can dig into sort of the understandings of adrenaline coursing through your veins and the fight and flight response. And in a way, one of the reasons that, you know, I am driven to horror and I enjoy horror is it gives me a chance to explore that which scares the crap out of me. And in doing so, in a way, kind of prepares me for that eventuality should it come. So, you know, staring death in the face makes death, depending how you approach it, seem a little less scary sometimes. Is broadly how I look at it.
Yeah, I definitely kind of take that and run with that concept in my part of the introduction. Andrea and I both have introductions in A Haunted History of Invisible Women. And in my introduction section in this book, I talk about how ghosts in particular are the one paranormal creature that we can't as easily discount. Ghosts are of us. We can become them. They could be our loved ones. So there is an intimacy to ghosts in particular. That's why I keep being drawn to them, both as a fiction writer. Ghosts appear in every single part of my fiction, and led me to being a ghost tour guide, and led Andrea and I into this jointly authored project of that intersection between our interests as living people and how that whatever happens across the veil is still trying to be this unanswered existential question. It's the divine mystery. And for ghosts in particular, there is that sense of us, that closeness to us, and the possibilities of our soul and energies and what may or may not live on, that I feel is a constant driver for me. It's actually an engine by which I continue to be looking and asking these questions, because we, you know, in our book and also as people, we try not to tell you what to think. We want you to bring your own conclusions to this, because one of the things we've noticed is that in the spooky business, the paranormal is deeply personal for every single person, and it's going to be different from one person to the next, how they relate to it.
I think I have to say as well.
Sorry, you can go ahead.
No, you go. I've spoken.
You kind of summed it up, and I don't have a ton to add because you're both very succinct. But I was thinking about the concept of mistakes and regret, the idea of being haunted by the past, by, you know, the cliche unfinished business, the many ways that we misstep in real lived life, and the idea of the lingering profound regrets and regrettable things that we have done as people, you know, the haunting of your subconscious, and all the mistakes that you make that come back to haunt you. So it's psychologically, it's just this idea that, I don't know, you have an imperfect world, and I'm also kind of into the idea of like this cosmic horror, in the sense that like the world doesn't always function perfectly. Like, I'm less inclined to look for apparitions than I am to be excited by glitches in the system and time slips and place memory and the uncanny, and the idea that this world that's supposed to function in a certain way and turn on its access in a certain way, sometimes also makes mistakes, and sometimes things go awry. It's just like the ghost in the machine, but it's the ghost in you and in our world. So I get a little cosmic sometimes with it. And that's why I think I really love the idea of time slips and place memory in that sense, haunting in that sense.
Well, I think a lot of people, if you use the word like paranormal, a lot of people automatically jump to ghost and think that the paranormal world is just ghost, and it's not. It encompasses everything, from anything that we can't explain scientifically, like glitches or time slips or cryptids, you know, Bigfoot, or all the things like that. Yeah, not just ghost and things like that. Kind of the whole everything that inspires horror in the genre is kind of paranormal.
Yeah,
things are what they shouldn't be.
Yeah, and you hit on something, Andrea. Just thinking about, you know, the universe and the world as we know it, and we're kind of sort of taught that, you know, what is seen is concrete, but there's so much that we don't know. And I don't think anybody has all the answers. And so the scientific community sometimes wants to kind of draw the line at only what we can see. And so I think it's interesting to ask questions. And I think there's a whole lot that we still haven't discovered. So it's definitely an interesting topic to explore.
Well, it's wondering where energy goes, isn't it? Because we know that energy cannot be lost. It can only be transferred. And so that kind of goes back to, you know, the question of what does happen after we die, because my view from a very personal point is kind of quite similar to how I view religion, in the sense of like, I don't definitively, it's not that I don't believe in it, but I haven't seen evidence of it. if that makes sense. So it's, for me, it's similar with paranormal. Like, I've never had a paranormal experience, but that doesn't mean that I don't deny other people's experiences and that there could be something else out there. There's no definitive truth or life in which I could say this doesn't exist. And that, I guess, is where a lot of, you know, that curiosity comes from, that kind of wondering on what is out there, what is it that we don't understand, and how can it get us?
Yeah, there's no objective reality.
I feel like, I mean, as someone who is a believer, I also think you should approach things with a certain amount of skepticism, though, because again, I don't believe that science and the mystical are at all at odds. I don't think they're at cross purposes. I think that the mystical is a part of science that we just don't quite have the language for. And I will be excited if and when we are able to pin some of these things down about where does that energy go. I mean, I think that's I'm full of wonder about that. And again, that sort of goes back to the divine mystery. I don't think that faith and science and any of these things are at cross purposes. They shouldn't be enemies, and we shouldn't as a society make them enemies, because then we really lose a lot of the truth of the matter, and we lose a lot of the nuance of the matter. And I think, as someone who does believe, I don't want to be led by my very active imagination in every sense, because we also know the human brain is so powerful, and it can even create like telekinetic circumstances. It can create wild and incredible ways to protect itself or make beautiful art. And so I am very well aware that my overactive imagination might go into a space that I think or have heard is haunted, and I might make something up. In the interest of truth, I mean, as you know, Andrea and I, as tour guides, we're very interested in giving you a true accounting, as best as we know, of the history of New York City, and then let you wonder about these other weird, uncanny things that have happened in these historic spaces. But I don't want to lead with something that might just be a flight of fancy or my imagination. So I really try to rule everything else out. And I've had too many experiences where everything else, logical and scientific, that, as you know, in terms of X, Y, or Z, that could have created this shadow or created this sound or created this cold spot or moved an object that I didn't move to a space when I was the only person in the area. These things that have happened to me where I'm like, I rule everything else out, and now all we have left is that's a paranormal. But I don't jump right to that, because then I think you lose a lot of credibility when you are in conversations like these, because I also want to leave room for doubt and room for suspicion. I am not so desperate to believe in something that I am challenged if someone else doesn't believe.
Yeah. And it's so good to ask questions, whether it's in religion or the paranormal, talking about whether we believe or don't believe in something, asking questions and being skeptical and not following something, you know, right off the bat and blindly, really researching and paying attention and analyzing those critical thinking skills is so important. And I wish we all did that more in life and in society, because, you know, there's a lot of just kind of jumping on bandwagons when let's ask some questions. And for sure. So what about, because I think we kind of touched a little bit on this, but some of these things, can they be metaphors, or are we kind of looking for metaphors, or are there some hidden metaphors for the human condition and human connection hidden in the stories and the folklore, the literature, or just maybe even in our fascination and our need to kind of talk about these things and explore these things? And even people who say, well, I can't watch a horror movie because it's too scary. I've never seen anyone walk away from a conversation about these things. I've never seen anyone, you go, I've got to get out of here, I can't talk about it. There's always a little bit of fascination with everybody. I don't know if you guys have found that as well.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Yeah, there's fascination from everybody with this topic. When I go and do events or anything like that, like paracons or festivals, I always get these people that come up to me and say, I don't believe in ghosts, but here's my ghost story. Or I don't believe in the paranormal, but here's my story. But they always preface it with saying, I don't believe in it, because they want to gauge, I think, to see how crazy I think they are. And then when I come back with, well, you think that's crazy, listen to what happened to me, you know, to kind of make them feel, it's not that one up thing, but it's kind of make them feel comfortable about it. And then they start sharing even more stories. And so I think people come into it because they don't want other people to think they're crazy. So they preface it with things like that. But to what you're saying, Sarah, yeah, I think there are a lot of tropes and stories and legends out there that are, for one, cautions to people not to do things. But I think a lot of them have a moral and a reason why they've been handed down, kind of in the Appalachian tradition. Folklore has been handed down. You have like the boogeyman. That's where that comes from. Don't go out in the woods at night. The boogeyman's going to get you. Or, even like the monster under your bed. It's kind of that thing from parents of, stay in the bed or the monster under your bed is going to get you. So I think a lot of these stories, necessarily a lot of the old ghost stories that you hear, like the Lady in White and things like that. There's stories of around the country of kid's school bus got hit by a train on these tracks, and now if you park your car there, they'll push you over the tracks. And these stories keep getting repeated over and over again. And like the bride who never got married because she was killed, or it's always the same story over and over, and it's told, and there's usually a moral there and a reason for that story becoming a trope, and of those people becoming kind of a cautionary tale, even like the Phantom Hitchhikers and things like that, kind of pervade pop culture as these warnings.
That makes me think of M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, how they conjured up this, this monster, to keep them inside the village.
Yeah, metaphors and tropes are really what we've created the whole with A Haunted History of Invisible Women. It's all broken down into tropes. And Death and the Maiden is a section on women dying young. Spinsters and widows, why are we so afraid of women alone? Bad girls, the fascination with women who transgress. Frauds, fakes, and myth making, because there's a whole lot, if you're looking at the history of spiritualism, while there's legitimate good there's a whole lot of frauds there. Talking to also about the concept of witches, and we have that in quotes, and the concept of mad women, we have that in quotes. All of these things are, and Eric mentioned several of the tropes that we dive into when you're talking about women in these ghost lore. There's a whole lot of parallels, and there's a whole lot of symbolism and metaphor. Andrea speaks to this in the beginning of her introduction. Do you want to follow up on that, Andrea?
I don't remember what I wrote in my introduction.
Well, you talk about about how women and ghost lore are entwined.
The feminine and the ghostly, for sure. As you were speaking, I was actually thinking about some of the ghost lore that I was doing last night on my Brooklyn Heights tour. And this is not feminine ghost lore, this is New York City stuff. The number of ghost stories that have to do with small churchyards and the disinterment of parishioners buried in those small churchyards reflects the anxieties of people in this small bucolic village that started to become part of New York City. And it started to outgrow its space, and these churches had to move, and the churchyards had to move, and what was built over them. And just the idea of folklore reflecting our anxieties. They are metaphors. And there's one really funny story where there was a guy that used to dress up as a ghost and pretend to be a ghost because he felt that was what people wanted to see. And he was playing like 2 shows nightly, and the neighborhood would come out and see him. And it's just this idea, like, or the Brooklyn Bridge. We're talking about the ghost of the Brooklyn Bridge, the defiance of nature. You're going to build this thing that spans the river, defying gravity, defying the gods. And it's just like the anxiety of like, are we doing the right thing? Is it okay for us to be imposing our will in this way? Then just the way that we kind of have the memory of our city's history and how it comes out in our ghosts. In terms of the specifically feminine, like, again, when I talk about women, like, I don't speak for all womankind. I don't want to be essentialist. I don't want to like just repeat these gender stereotypes, but a lot of our ghost stories and a lot of our research is based in 19th century lore. That's where a lot of the stuff comes from that we deal with. So when we talk about certain tropes, we may be referencing older models, but historically speaking, women and death have been deeply entwined. For example, funerals in the 19th century, funerals were a home affair. They were a domestic affair. They fell under the domestic sphere. Obviously, childbirth and child raising during that era, infant mortality and child mortality, those figures hovered at about 20%. So that means 1 in 5 children didn't live to see their 5th birthday. obviously childbirth. I remember like this Twitter thing going around a couple of years ago where it was like, if, you know, what would you die of? What old-timey disease would you die of if you lived 300 years ago or whatever? Every single woman was like childbirth, duh. So, and quite sadly, again, like a lot of this stuff is rooted in history, but maternal and fetal mortality rates are still shockingly high in the United States. So especially for women of color, they're twice as high for women of color. So, you know, the more things change, right? So you have this liminal state where a woman hovers between life and death for hours or days at a time during labor and delivery. Women care for the aged, they care for the dead and the dying. Women are more likely to outlive their spouses, but just statistically speaking. So you have widowhood, the omnipresent reminder of death, living with death. You know, it's just, it's, I think I wrote that we live cheek by jowl with death, which is, you know, kind of historically how it's always been for us. And then there's just a whole lot of metaphor. It's right there in the title, you know, the invisibility of women. We lack a voice, we lack an ability to speak and be heard in public forums. We are often not believed, whether that's when we relate a ghost story or at the doctor's office or in the courtroom. We're often silenced and called crazy. So, you know, that metaphor, it's like an Ouroboros. It just keeps on going back in on itself. It doesn't stop. It's eternal.
I find it interesting as well that you mentioned about the fact that, you know, people struggle sometimes to watch horror things. The amount of people I know that claim that they hate watching horror things and will happily sit and watch Jeffrey Dahmer documentaries and anything that is true crime. Like, I find it such a weird dichotomy that's kind of, because a lot of the stuff that I would class as horror that I've watched, I'm like, doesn't beat anything to like the real horrors of some of the things that these people have done.
Right. And it's very, a lot of it becomes kind of fanciful and almost cheesy, some of it. But yeah, that's a great point that you bring up. And, you know, that's for people to say, I don't like horror, even slashers. And I always like, I kind of get cut just a little bit when people are like, oh, horror, you know, it's like, but they're not all slashers. Because I think that most people, when they think of horror in the genre, they think of slashers, and there's so much more to it and there's so much more depth. But, you know, people are so quick to say, oh, I don't do any of that. But yeah, it's part of life. And so there's real horror happening every single day. You turn on the news and you're getting a real life horror story. And we sit and watch the news sometimes almost as if it were Netflix. And so, yeah, that's a great point, Daniel.
Yeah, I find it just endlessly fascinating because I used to sit with my parents when they were watching the news, and I just get up out of the room because it was so miserable and depressing. But then I'd go upstairs and I'd watch like 6 episodes of Midnight Mass. So like but then for me, like that's fiction. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's all, as you say, it's all metaphor. It's all rooted in imagination. Like, we know that it's not real. Like, it's a weird kind of pleasurable entertainment. And coming back to your point again about sort of like metaphor and things, and like I'm deeply fascinated, especially at this point in my career, about monster horror and investigating a lot of like different sort of monsters out there in mythology. Like, I'm doing a lot of reading of Lovecraft at the minute and exploring that mythos, which is so much bigger than I thought it was. Like, I know it was big, but I didn't realize how big it was. And yeah, like you say, each monster in its own way represents something we as humans are, quote, I guess, ashamed of, or made to be ashamed of, due to many things over the years that were meant to keep us safe, or, you know, influences of religion and how that has affected the things that we're not allowed to technically do, and how monsters can be, you know, gluttonous and lustful and all these horrible things. And it's very interesting to kind of like see the development and the evolution of monsters within horror, because over the last sort of 30-40 years of cinema as well, we've become more and more desensitized to what we think horror is. And so people more and more are trying to increase the graphic horror effect of what it is on screens and in books as well. I was watching an episode of Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities last night. And the first episode, I won't do spoilers for people that haven't yet watched it because it's fairly new, but like the first episode of that is just monstrous. There's so much more. It's a lot. But yeah, I just find monsters very, very fascinating.
Do you know that H.P. Lovecraft was inspired by the tunnels beneath Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn Heights?
Really?
I mean, the horror at Red Hook. Yeah, that's all Brooklyn Heights right there.
Nice. I'll check that one out.
Little subterranean infrastructure, supersonic phobia, and there you go. He was on his way.
Nice.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the monsters too, when you guys were talking about monsters a minute ago, I was thinking about my favorite monster, which is the Wendigo.
Hey, I wrote a book about them.
You wrote a book about Wendigo? Oh my God.
Yeah, pull it out, Daniel. Bring it, show it to us.
Okay. Maybe I subconsciously already knew that and I was staring at your book. Tell me more about it, because this is one of my favorite monsters.
So I kind of, well, I tried to take a little twist on them, but yeah, they're kind of a plague-like infestation that come upon this town in the way that I've kind of interpreted them anyway. Depends what you want to know, whether my version or like the actual version of, of the Wendigo.
That's awesome. No, you've made my TBR pile one book higher. Thank you.
There you go.
Everyone go purchase it today. All right.
Hey.
Seamless plug.
Yeah.
Smooth, unplanned.
It's the
I always get I love winter horror, whether it's Wendigo or even The Shining, and people will dump on The Shining. They'll dump on the movie and I'm like, get out of here. I love that movie. I will stand.
No. Yeah, I am a huge fan of the Jack Nicholson version. So
see, my problem with that, I mean, having just been to the Stanley actually, so I was just there at the hotel that inspired Stephen King. It's not where they shot The Shining. So the original source material hotel is legitimately haunted, absolutely creepy. I was woken up regularly during the night by sounds I could not figure out, and there were shadows that nothing could make in the corner of the room. So that was not a restful night at the Stanley Hotel. So I understand how like the underslept characters could kind of, flourish there. But my only issue with The Shining is that I don't really see the descent into madness. It's just like they're just, I wish that Kubrick and all of his genius and or abuse of his cast, which he was very abusive to his cast, that he could have been like, hey, can we slowly start to go lose a grip? But that's my one beef with it. I mean, it is brilliant, and I think about it often. So clearly, it's got things to it for sure. And also the source material is legitimately uncanny. So there's definitely something there for that.
I'm gonna have to go back and analyze that because that is an excellent point, and not that we're going to get into writing how-tos and things like that, but yeah, really having a clear idea or really being able to see how he, what happened to him, and kind of showing a progression there instead of, all right, I'm working here and boom, now I'm going to kill my family, which it wasn't quite like that, but that's a good point.
It felt like that to me. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. I know that we've skipped a step here. And I know Jack Nicholson is capable of giving us a descent. I just wanted to draw that out a little more as a reader, as a fan of Stephen King, and also as a fan of Kubrick. So but that's
not know about. Didn't know about the abuse, so we'll.
Oh, it's bad. I'm sorry for anyone who.
You've disillusioned me, Liana.
It's bad. It's real bad. I'm sorry. And it happened to it happened both to Nicholson and to Shelley Duvall. The stuff that happened to Shelley Duvall was particularly harrowing.
Yeah, that's terrible.
I do have it on pretty good authority that's part of the reason that King was happy to do a second version of The Shining.
Correct.
Written and directed by another group. Yeah, because it was exactly that same sort of thing of he felt that transition was lacking. And obviously that's very, very fundamental, especially again, like you say, not getting into how-tos, but if you want to connect with the horror on a very, very human level, you have to feel some kind of empathy for that character. And when the characters are off the gate, it's very, very difficult to feel sorry for someone who then, tears everything apart.
So true.
I just like the way it looks.
Yeah.
The color grading alone was eerie. If you turn the sound off on that film, just the color grading makes your skin crawl. So for sure.
There's actually science in why they painted what they painted and what color they painted it. So especially the room where the ghost is in the bathtub, that's meant to be actually like asylum green, sort of like there's a whole, there's so much richness in all of this, in this beautiful and terrible thing, which is ultimately, isn't that the sublime, isn't that the Gothic, the beautiful and the terrible, all at once, even in the process of this film, where it's like, yes, we have some beautiful product, but it also was a terrible experience for most of the people making it, but yet here we are still talking about it. So this is the power of art, and it's complicated and it's messy, and it often has, heroes and villains and all of the above, even in the reality of it, let alone the product.
which is like life, because there's so much beauty and ugliness in life all at the same time, you know.
Mm-hmm. Why shy away from it?
Visual or aesthetic that I'm always a sucker for, besides snow, is water. And so that's why I love Black Lagoon, Cat People, you know, anything where there's a swimming scene, a water scene. And when we were writing our book, the chapter on mothers, I was struck by how continuously the motifs of snow and rain and water came up in almost every ghost story with a mother in it. And the imagery there is beautiful. And there was this one story about a woman named Catherine Sutter, whose ghost wanders around Kansas. Her children died in a snowstorm, and it's all like swirling snow and wandering on bleak prairies. And it's just like, it's really lovely. Obviously, La Llorona's got the most famous water imagery for a mother story. And then there's another story about a ghostly mother who dies in a marsh. And it's just like all that kind of like amniotic, aquatic maternal imagery. It's so beautiful. So for me, like, one of the questions that we have been asked during some of our readings was, what do you think makes a good ghost story? And ghosts are so ephemeral, and they're so slender. The stories are always just so thin, and it's basically a person seeing a thing. And then when you add in the imagery and the romanticism and the beauty and the poetry of it, like, that's what makes a really good story for me, is some kind of visual that arrests me. So yeah, I'm such a sucker for snow and ice and water. It's crazy.
Water is a powerful symbol in
right.
nature and in life. It really is.
It's terrifying. To have 70% of the world covered in a liquid and depths that we've never even traversed, and they're still pulling up things and finding things just washed up on the shore that we've got no understanding. But we're happy to look at Mars, like trying to get there, but we still haven't even explored the rest of Earth. Like, it's very interesting. And even just because I went for a big phase of getting sucked into sort of like the deep sea when they were doing all the discoveries, and they came across like the anglerfish and the vampire squid and all that kind of stuff. Like, the adaptations just kind of prove the power of biology outside of obviously systems and realms like our own, because a lot of our horror seems to be some kind of monster represented in human form in some way. Most of the sort of the biggest, most famous monsters arguably are in some way human form. I mean, even Cthulhu, you could argue, is like big arms, big legs, stand up straight, kind of quite human, bar the tentacles in his face. But then seeing sort of like gelatinous blobs and things of like teeth on jelly and stuff like that is just that's the stuff that I love, because it just adds a whole new dimension to what the horror can be.
The demons down under the sea. What is it that Poe says in Annabelle Lee?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think also, I mean, with the talking about the beauty in ice and water and snow, I think there's also that subconscious thing of like, it's beautiful, but it's not our element as humans. And it can very much kill you quickly because we're not adapted to those type of environments. And so there's a subconscious thing there and a psychological thing of, yes, the snow is beautiful. The cold is beautiful, water is beautiful, but also we're not suited to those environments. And so somewhere in the back of your reptilian brain, it's like, caution, because it still can be deadly, and because we don't have gills to breathe underwater. And then also the thing of, I don't know where this quote came from. I don't remember where I heard it, but we're not afraid of the dark. We're afraid of what's in the dark. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of the thing with like the ocean. We're not necessarily afraid of the ocean, but we're afraid of what we can't see that's in it. Kind of like Daniel was saying, with all these monsters that are real, we make up these monsters, but there's a lot of things in the ocean, especially the deep ocean, that look like things we can't even imagine being real living creatures.
Yeah. What's that thing with the glowing eyes? That don't they protrude from its head?
Oh, the anglerfish, I think. Is that an angler?
Yeah.
The little lure.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also one of my favorite ones called a barrelite, and it's basically this sort of, I don't know, a couple of feet long, but the entire top of half of its head is see-through, and it has sort of pretend eyes that are actually light sensors, and then like a little sort of brainstem that looks up to try and track glimmers of food so it can catch it. Some weird stuff down there.
Yeah.
All right. Who wants to go swimming after the show today? Well, do you guys think, so do our beliefs inform the stories, or do the stories inform our beliefs, or a little of both? Folklore, tales.
Again, right? It folds in on itself. It's both, I think.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, I think it has to be both. And when people ask, how did you choose the ghosts in our book? That's it very quickly became a chicken or the egg scenario for us, because we don't like, something had to catch us. Some part of the history had to catch us. Some part of like our own things that we're seeking as authors, our favorite things to examine. And so it's like, where do we stop? And that ghost story begins where, our particular interests, we knew going into this that there were going to be some things that were going to be expected of us, but we also had to be very clear that people understood that this was not a compendium. This is not an encyclopedia. It's not every female ghost that we could find. We didn't have the space. It had to be, like a 95,000 word book. So we were very constrained. So we chose stories that spoke to us, that also had something to say in a conversation with each of the tropes that we chose. So, I mean, we really have been describing this book as a series of prompts, because we are looking at, okay, what does society say about a woman who has been cast as a witch? Because we know the women of the Salem witch trials were not witches. But it's ironic now, because Salem is now witch city. They've embraced that, and there are practicing witches in Salem now. So there's this interesting thing of what starts what and what begets what. And I don't know that we can actually go back to the root of it, because we are the products of all of the storytellers that have come before us, and all of their collective mythology is in us, is in our psychological DNA, our literal DNA. So I feel like we're just, sort of anthropologists kind of looking at the layers of human storytelling. And that's difficult when you're trying to find the source of an urban legend. It's almost impossible. So, we grapple with that, certainly, with how something came to be. And the clearest instance is that I could find in any of my chapters that I wrote was the Witch's Curse of Bucksport, Maine. The curse did not appear or occur in society until this very weird flaw in the stone of Colonel Buck's monument became visible, and it looked like a foot. It looked like a stocking foot. So that looked so specific that an urban legend had to be created around it, because people were like, no, a mark doesn't just appear on a tombstone. Well, it's just a flaw. It's just a flaw in the stone. And there's clearly a mark there. And yeah, sure, it does look like a dangling stocking foot, but people just needed to have some sort of witch's revenge, which sort of spoke to the concept of a helplessness of witches being accused and being powerless. And here's this revenge from beyond the grave. So it almost became this cautionary tale of be careful who you condemn, because it will come back to haunt you, sort of thing. Even though there were no witch trials in Maine. None of this, it's completely fabricated, so much so that there has to be like a plaque by this guy's grave and be like, yeah, he's the founder of the town. None of this is real. And yet this myth, this witch's curse, pops up in all of these different paranormal books. And so, the power and the persistence of myth is so excitingly overwhelming.
Yeah. And do you feel like we sometimes have a need to believe some of these things? Like, there's a need in society to really convince ourselves that something is real? Not sure what that is.
Some of it comes back to community identity, doesn't it? I mean, there are certain places where almost the entire identity, as you say, with the Salem witch trials, is built around this legend, this kind of well-known, globally recognized event. And it just gets ingrained. Like, I know there's people build entire cults, entire belief systems. You look at and no offense to anyone who in here is a believer in Scientology, but Scientology is documented to have been created by a particular person. I forget his name, Hubbard. A fair few years back. Like, it's documented that it's fake, but people dive into it and they believe, because some people need something to lean on and to anchor themselves into why they're here in some kind of purpose. I think as well, kind of like circling all around this, like it's worth looking into the idea of dreams and nightmares, because there are, people who have never really experienced sort of grand scales of trauma, but that doesn't mean that nightmares don't come to us all and horrible things don't happen in our mind that we might have never seen, we might never have experienced, but for some reason our brain is trying to tell us these stories. So it's kind of, as you say, it's like an Ouroboros. I never had to say it, Ouroboros for the snake thing.
Ouroboros.
Ouroboros.
Correct.
It's like the Ouroboros of kind of just horror, really. It's as we keep coming back to, it's like part of our nature to group around these things, to be scared by these things, and to adopt them in some way.
Well, it kind of speaks to Sarah's question about what came first, the myth or the, what comes first, the ghost story, the myth, or the desire to believe. Sorry, every ghost tour guide in the world right now is a horse. So the desire to believe, it's like with the witch's curse. I was just thinking about how that speaks to Sarah's question, because the witch's curse is such a myth. It's such a trope. It's such a movie cliche. But the number of witches' curses in this country alone, like they're everywhere. Like every little small town has one. And, the way they're all related to the way the graves look, the way the women behave, like you just kind of expect a dying witch to curse the people who are executing her. So it's I don't know what came first, the idea of the witch's curse, these women's graves, these women's stories, but it's, again, that's the Oberos. It's like you fully expect any witch worth her salt upon execution. Yeah, she'll curse you. That's what I would do. So it's, I don't know. I mean, it's only polite.
Yeah, for sure. Well, what in any of these things, and thinking about folklore and legend, thinking about all of these nonfiction tales, things that things like in books that you guys write, any of these things throughout your life, what threads, have been kind of woven in there that led each of you to the career path that you're now on? And no pressure.
Like that's such a big,
I feel like I should be paying £50 an hour for this question.
I know.
Sat back on the couch.
I actually found, and this will speak to something that Eric and I spoke about on his podcast. I actually found the paranormal as almost a window into a certain amount of acceptance. I was always a weird kid. I was always a kid that just didn't quite fit in, and the paranormal just spoke to me. And I've utilized that as an author, in that the paranormal is a way for my 19th century marginalized characters in a world that has oppressed them and kept them at heel, depending on their marginalization, in different circumstances. Whether it's their identity, whether it's their sexuality, whether it's their race, whether it's their belief structure, any of these various things, gender roles, things like that were very restrictive in 19th century society. The paranormal, I utilize it as a way to get around societal constraints and to crack those open and say, okay, there's not an etiquette manual for this interaction with this supernatural event. So we're gonna make our own rules and utilize the paranormal as a way around towards agency, which a lot of 19th century fiction was dealing with concepts of agency. And so I found a certain way that, because there's a lot of othering that happens in the supernatural, sometimes you can kind of take that on and almost take a certain ownership of it if you yourself have been othered. Do you want to say anything about that, Eric? Because we had a good conversation about that sense of like, can we use this as a way to make things more inclusive?
Yeah, and I think the paranormal in general, because we, especially dealing with ghosts and death, I think that's the one equalizer in life, is that we all are the same in death. No matter if you're gay, straight, black, white, Native American like I am, it doesn't matter. We're all the same in death. And I think it unifies across the board. And I think that's why the paranormal community is so, for the most part, is inclusive. But when you go to TV and things, we talked about this too, Liana, when you go to TV and things, it's very much any minorities are marginalized, and it's all straight, white, muscular men, on there, that's hyper masculinity for whatever reason. And just women aren't well represented on there. People of color aren't well represented. Gays, lesbians aren't well represented on TV in general, but it's also switched over to the paranormal, even though the paranormal community at large is very accepting of marginalized people. And like Liana was saying, is very accepting. And that's why a lot of us gravitate towards that in a way as well, to be accepted for believing in what some people think is crazy or out there. But also us just being ourselves. And in the general paranormal community, I don't really see too much hate. I hate the word para-unity, because the people that use that are the ones that are the worst and marginalizing. And they preach prayer unity, but it's all a crock. But yeah, it just brings, it's a way to bring people together that have certain beliefs, and it's also an open forum to talk about different beliefs that whether it's what's the word I'm looking for, whether it's something that we can prove or not, or even just theorizing about things out in the world that we don't understand. It's just a way to be understood in a way, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think my journey into it's a touch different, and actually something that potentially might have sprung into my mind this week. I'm not sure, but there's a deep-rooted thread of existentialism in a lot of my life and my studies and things that I've done. So like I mean, I came to horror probably through the Goosebumps book series when I was like 9 or 10 for whatever reason. Like I lapped them up, don't know why, but then kind of moved a little bit away from horror until maybe 15, 16 when I read my first Stephen King and I read Cujo and just fell in love with it. Like there was something about that opening chapter where there's sort of the ambiguity of something in the closet that may or may not be a monster, may not be a ghoul of some kind, that kind of follows through the book. And then at university, I kind of veered off in the last minute. No, I didn't. I wrote my dissertation on existentialism and the works of Samuel Beckett. And I've always kind of questioned people's, don't want to say this wrong, I've questioned how people view religion, how people view life, how people view death, just throughout all my life. And I don't know why that is. It's just something that I've kind of wondered about, because there are people that approach it with such certainty and I've never seen the evidence. So that curious part of my mind to go kind of like, well, that's not to say that they're wrong, but that's for me to go, well, what are they basing that on, and trying to understand sort of the psychology of that kind. And then when it came to actually putting pen to paper and beginning writing my first works, I originally started in fantasy, trying to write this, as you do when you write your first book. I was like, I'm going to write an 8-book like fantasy series. Why not? Start there. Fell very, very hard at the post very, very quickly. And then read a book of shorts by Stephen King, Everything's Eventual, which is incredible. And just found myself being drawn into kind of like the darker side of things. I found that I worked quite well in that genre. But as I kind of said earlier, it also gives you a chance to explore life and death and the known and the unknown. I would say I've had a fairly vanilla upbringing. I've not really sort of been too traumatized by any kind of like events or anything. Like there's nothing particularly dark that would have pushed me into horror. But just that exploration of the things that I wouldn't otherwise have access to, because I feel like if I write romance, like I've been pushed into seeing that stuff my entire life. Like my family is a very Disney-led family. I've read a lot of thrillers at one point and kind of like almost went down that path, but yeah, horror was exploration. And then the kind of linchpin for everything else was the fact that everyone that I meet in horror is lovely. And it seems like such a dichotomy, because so many, you imagine these horror writers, these like horrible ghouls, just like hoods up and just tapping at the keyboard, just like everything by candlelight. And it's no, we're lovely people. Like, you know, we find ways to expel the demons in our writing so that we can live as a pleasant member of society most of the time.
Yeah, I had the fortune of meeting Stephen King one time, and him and his wife. And they're don't get me wrong, there's like a air of weirdness to them that you can just kind of feel, but they were extremely nice people. I got to spend about 45 minutes to an hour with them, and they were extremely nice and just down to earth, normal people with a little weirdness there. But yeah, but like you're saying, like horror people, I think in the paranormal, it's the same way. And I think kind of what you were touching on with religion, that's a little bit of why I got into the paranormal as well, was exploring religion through the guise of paranormal, because I've experienced things, even though I'm a skeptical believer, I've experienced things in paranormal that I can explain. I've seen things that I can explain, but also it came to me in a time when I was exploring what I believe religious wise, and then trying to reconcile all of it together and looking at it through those different lenses of different religions and things.
Has anyone yet watched 28 Days Haunted? Pretty new on Netflix. I don't know if it's just in the UK at the minute, but
on the list.
I started watching it, but I haven't watched the whole series.
I binged that whole damn thing. I wasn't even planning to, but it was fantastic.
All right, it's going on the list. I'm doing it.
Andrea, did you want to weigh in, Andrea, on what started your journey?
Oh, sure. I was just so interested in all your stories. I was looking at these threads and these commonalities. acceptance, just an interest in veering away from the mundane. I have to defend your Disney family though, Daniel. We're a Disney the Sleeping Beauty, like the original cartoon, it's so beautifully drawn. It's so gorgeous. The scene where she's going up the steps and Maleficent, I don't know. It's all about like beauty for me. It's about nature. I was drawn as a very small child to anything magical, anything ghostly. I loved roaming around in the woods at my Nana's cottage. Just imagining I was in a different place, a different time. I don't know. For me, it's just like this wonderful counterbalancing to the daily grind and all the dull, ordinary things that we need to do. I always dreamt that I was like a witch in a cottage somewhere. I think, I was a weird little kid. I used to go into the library in the dullest imaginable suburb it's a suburb of Toronto, Canada. So there's so many layers of dullness there. But I used to go to the library and as a small child, read extensively about the European witch trials. And I couldn't put those books down. I have actually modified my life so that I work hard during like the August to October harvest season. I hibernate in the winter. I come out again in the spring. I don't know. I just want to be a wild woman in the woods with my witches and ghosts.
That sounds wonderful. You also said that your Czech background, like you instead of hide and seek, y'all would play bloody knee, that's pretty metal.
We are a very metal people. I am a legitimate bohemian, and we had a version of hide and seek that we played in the dark, and it was called Bloody Knee. And Uncle Lumiere would just roam around this big cavernous house in Ottawa, going bloody knee, and the children would hide. I mean, I don't know. There's something's going on, but yeah. Also, maybe I think just some people are born spooky, right? We just are. We're natural born spooky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, what current projects do you guys have in the works? So what upcoming projects do you have in the works? Now is the time for all the plugs. We want to hear all the fun stuff that's going on.
Well, Andrea and I are, we are talking about trying to get a follow-up volume to A Haunted History of Invisible Women going. So we hope that you all will purchase A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts, so that we can in fact continue with volume 2, which is sort of dependent on numbers for volume 1. But so we've been populating a spreadsheet. We've got there is of course so much we couldn't put in here that we know we want to return to thematically, explore some other things. We've been talking about, like, and some of it's been taking hold as we were on book tour. We were sitting at Word Bookstore in Brooklyn, deciding who was going to do what section. And I realized that, like, I like night driving, but Andrea is terrified of night driving. So she gets to do the roadside ghosts and the dangerous turns ghosts, because, you should write about what scares you. So like we're sorting that out as we go. And I'm working on a couple of new fiction projects that will return to my great love, which is historical fantasy and historical paranormal. And I have some ongoing fiction that is both audiobook as well as digital on Scribed, where I'm narrating my own work there. So I have several novella length speculative fiction pieces that'll be coming out through the next year there. So I want to be continuing both in fiction and nonfiction, all of which will have a speculative paranormal bent, because I just don't like anything else enough to want to write a book about it.
There you go. That's awesome. Thank you, man. I can't wait. Got to get a copy of that book, because I was reading the blurb yesterday, and I was like, this story needs to be told. These stories need to be told. So that was exciting.
Thank you. That's what we've hoped. This book has brought these concepts together, because it's not just a book about ghost stories. It's a book about women's history, and it's also a discussion about society and these tropes that these stories were continuing to kind of enforce or question. And it's just, again, we hope to get an ongoing dialogue going about this.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you. Andrea.
Oh God. At this time of year, my brain is like, okay, I got to get my kid a flu shot, a haircut, a COVID booster, got to clean the kitchen.
Hey, those are all valid upcoming projects.
I have no room in my head for upcoming projects. I'm just like, I got to catch up with my everyday after the last 6 weeks. In January, Liana and I will write the proposal for book 2. And then I'll have to start the whole cycle all over again. Running the business, running the ghost tour business. So can I just say that you don't know what busy is till you've launched a book and run a ghost tour company in October simultaneously? Bananas.
It is bananas.
Nuts. So
if you're
right now, my goal is to rest. I'm like going to rest. That's
a legitimate goal.
Yeah,
it is legit. And if you are curious about said ghost tour company, please look up Burrows of the Dead.
Yes.
Burrows of the Dead. So you will find stuff. I am also an employee of said company. So and we will have cool things happening throughout the end of the year, and then take a well-earned break.
For tax purposes, you're an independent contractor.
Oh.
Correct.
Very important.
Correct. Yes.
I'm just putting that out there.
Just in case any accountants are watching. I get a 1099, everybody.
Yeah, CPAs, they love us.
Like a great reason for all of us to go to New York. Just take a impromptu trip to New York City.
I'd love to do that.
Do it.
I've done a few of the local ones in the UK around all the medieval buildings, the cathedrals and stuff, and they are endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, you learn a lot of history. You learn history that you probably, and Eric and I talked about this the last time he was on the show, how much history you can learn just by studying the paranormal and hauntings.
That's where it's all rooted from, yeah.
What are Eric and Daniel's upcoming projects? I want to hear from you guys too.
So for me, my main projects at the minute, I run a company, I guess, called Activated Authors, in which I coach authors and help them write their first books. Well, not even just their first books. It's a writing community in which I jump on live sprints of everyone every week, and I help people get the words down. And I coach people towards being more productive and getting more stuff done. So at the minute, I'm offering a 30-day free trial for anyone that wants to join in and just check it out and see what's going on. If you're interested, particularly in self-publishing, activatedauthors.com. I am a little bit involved this year, not so much as I have been in previous years, but the Other Stories podcast, which is on the t-shirt and is the podcast that I run with a few of my writer friends, Hawk and Cleaver. We've recently passed 10 million downloads on that. And we've just released our 5-part Halloween episode for this year. It's called The Toy Factory, which was written by Luke Condor with some assistance from myself. So check that out if you haven't, because it is a lot of fun. And I'm also in the throes at the minute of launching a horror community for writers, writersofhorror.org, and it's a non-profit focused on helping horror writers get into the biz, communicate, network with other horror writers, and kind of accelerate how they're getting on with their fiction. And then as well as that, I've got a few sort of fiction projects in the works. But if you want to find out all that I'm up to, just go to Daniel Wilcox, and that's WILLCOCKS.com, and you can keep up to date with me all over there.
All right.
I am going to finally finish my first book.
I was going to ask you about your book.
Yeah, it's just been a busy year, and it kind of got put on the back burner. But it's called Small Town Haunts and Legends of Tennessee, and about 70% history, 30% hauntings. Because, like we talked, the history is, I think, very important to understand the hauntings, and just some fascinating history and legends around Tennessee, as well as some interesting ghost stories. Kind of trying to get in there things that people haven't heard unless you live in that little town. Staying away from the bigger cities like Nashville and Chattanooga and all that, because you could find those stories anywhere. I also got so many public ghost hunts coming up at the first of next year that we're planning. At least have 8, I think, already planned for next year. I'm going to take a break this winter. I'll continue with season 3 of the Unseen Paranormal podcast, which is doing really well, and get some other projects on the burner, on the back burner, that will come to fruition next year as well. We just had a Paracon that I helped put on that was very successful for its first year. So we will be starting the planning phases of the one for next year. So lots of things going on. Lots of upcoming things that I can't talk about as well. So yeah, stay tuned. And you can find the Unseen Paranormal podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts or music, or at the Unseen. It's actually unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And I'm on all the social medias.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Liana and Andrea, where can we find you?
All social media. I tend to be most active on Twitter and Instagram. So on Twitter, I'm Eliana Renee. On Instagram, it's all 3 names, LeAnna ReneeHieber. That's my .com, my name there. And yeah, you can find our book wherever books are sold, in digital, audiobook, and trade paperback, thanks to Kensington Books.
Okay.
And you can usually find me at, well, I'm mostly active on Instagram, Burrows of the Dead, and burrowsofthedead.com has all the tour info and stuff. So you can check us out there.
All right, awesome. And before we go, does anyone have a favorite trope? Because now I'm kind of curious what your favorite horror tropes are.
Ooh.
My favorite horror trope is the unreliable narrator, because I really love the exploration of who is telling the story, why, how, and what of it is real and what of it is imagined. And that is it is a never ending source of fascination for me. And that's why I did title one of the chapters that I wrote in this, The Unreliable Narrator. So between that and my introduction section is called Existential Questions. So to tie in with Daniel's interest there, like, absolutely. I think some of us are born in an existential crisis and we just kind of live into it.
It's painful. I'll springboard off of that, because that's pretty much the same for me. Like I've, especially this year, I found that I'm a very, very big fan of smaller works told first person, where you can really get into a character's head and, as you say, follow that unreliable narrator, because again, it allows that connection with the human element, because we don't know everything that's going on, and that's half of where this book's come from for me. So that's mine too.
Yeah, that's my second favorite one, I think.
What's your favorite one?
My favorite would have to be the open ending, where you think you destroyed all of the evil, bad stuff, but that little thing that someone looking from the window as the car drives off, or the shadow in the corner, that something is still left. It's not really gone, or is it? We don't know.
I'm gonna double down on both of those. Those are both excellent.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite. I just like storytelling in general and all the different stories.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's great. And it's hard to pick a favorite, but you guys have been awesome today. This has been really a fascinating conversation and discussion in all of these things. And you've given me a lot to think about. So thank you all for coming on and getting like really philosophical and deep.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I think that's you hit upon, I think, what is the greatest thing about this genre is it is in fact deeply philosophical, because it really is, at the end of the day, going back to the stuff of life and death, and like it's imminently relatable, and it's definitely on everybody's mind a lot. So and I think it's actually, this genre is a healthy way to explore that. So yeah, thanks everyone, because I have a lot of food for thought. So I definitely, that this is, some of these thoughts are going to go into the story I'm drafting this evening. So thank you for being a part of that.
You're most welcome.
Like how horror is so disreputable and people are so elitist about it, but it's like the deepest, really, of all the genres.
It really is. And I hope that we can shed some light on that and maybe encourage people to step into that a little bit more, explore it a little bit more, find out what it's really about, and that it is more than just slashers. So.
Yeah.
There's a whole spectrum of horror, yeah. Even for kids, there's horror.
That's just jerk move right there.
Thank you guys again. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and that spooky season, the end of it comes with some rest and relaxation for all of us. And hope to have you guys on sometime again, because this again was fascinating and I really enjoyed it. So thank you and have a great week.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.